Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today we're going to be screening The Legend of Rita, directed by Volker Schlöndorff. This film from 2000 is a look into the radical politics of Germany during the Cold War, specifically during the period of terrorist groups in the 1970s. It's thought of by many people as a kind of comeback film for Volker Schlöndorff, who of course is best known for The Tin Drum. We'll be talking about that and its politics and its cinematic form after today's screening. It's a pleasure to welcome back to City Cinematheque Leonard Court, a noted expert on politics and cinema. Now, journey back to Germany during the Cold War with Volker Schlöndorff's The Legend of Rita. Welcome back to City Cinematheque, and welcome back from the Cold War and some pretty dicey days in Germany. It's a very interesting film in its portrayal of politics, how it tells a story, and where it fits in the overall work of Volker Schlöndorff, truly a distinguished filmmaker. To chat with us about that, we have a good old friend, as it were, of City Cinematheque, Leonard Court, a distinguished writer and critic who has specialized for many years in the relationship between politics and the cinema, including books on World War II, American culture and cinema, and of course he's well known to many of the readers of Cineast for his many essays there on films from around the world, but with a special place in his heart for the films of Central and Eastern Europe and their engagement with politics. Len, yes. Let's just start with, you've been tracking, as it were, Volker Schlöndorff for quite a while. He's been on your radar. Place him for us in the moment in which we see this film. Where's he come from, and what does this film represent in his sort of trajectory? This is a very recent film, only 5 years old or so.
Yeah, Volker Schlöndorff was part of the new German cinema with Wenders and Herzog and Fassbinder and his former wife, Marguerite von Trotta. He was probably the most conventional of those directors, the one who did literary adaptations. The most famous, I suppose, is his adaptation of Robert Musil's Young Torless, and he's done Swan in Love from Proust and Circle of Deceit, a very interesting film about Lebanon, about Beirut, with Bruno Ganz. And also he's done a number of political films. One of his more famous films, which he did with Van Trotta, which deals with terrorism, was The Lost Honor of Katrina Blum. And that, which came out in 1976, in a sense is a precursor to this film about terrorism, about Germany's relationship to terrorism. In recent years, I know he's running a studio in Berlin, formerly East Berlin,
right.
And has
Babelsberg,
and has returned to Germany after a sojourn here and after doing work in other places. His last movie, which you mentioned to me before the program, was The Ninth Man, a Holocaust-related film. But his career has been somewhat in the doldrums. At one time, he was an extremely well-known director who was making one very successful film after another. He was probably also the director who was, The Lost Honor was a commercial film, was probably one of the most commercial of those directors, but always consistently intellectual and often political.
Right.
The work usually coming from the left, without being sectarian, but with a kind of left critique and left sympathies.
Right. And can I just mention one other, which is, of course, the one for which he got the largest number of...
Tin Drum.
The Tin Drum, which remains a controversial film. Certainly it's a film that has now a place in the canon of post-war German cinema, in the canon of literary adaptations, but because The Tin Drum tells German history through the voice of a boy who is stunted as a kind of grotesque Peter Pan, it's problematic to many people in conservative societies because it's a particularly grotesque view of history. So he has had this consistent interest in not only political films, but very specifically in the kinds of conditions that lead to violence in societies, political violence, and to terror, into terrorism. What's going on? Well, tell us a little bit about what's being portrayed in this film, because obviously we're talking about kinds of events that were taking place in Germany 30 years ago, because this is an historical film itself. Who are these folks?
Well, it's the late 60s, early 70s, though the time scheme here is a little later. But the movement, the terrorist brigades, begin in the late 60s, early 70s. They're part of a larger radical movement of anarchists, counterculture anarchist hippies, but political hippies who operate in Germany in this period, Rudi Dutschke being one of them, who are not quite violent in their commitments, but basically anti-electoral, anti the West German state.
Right.
The Red Brigades are an offshoot of that, and the Red Army faction, Baader Meinhof, they're more than Baader Meinhof. There are a number of terrorist groups,
okay.
And they are offshoots of this, and they are the most radical, and believe that in kidnapping, arson, assassination of power wielders, of pieces of the power elite, and bank robberies. Right. They engage in these actions because the state is seen as a semi-fascist state. The society is only corrupt and ignominious. It has betrayed all moral values. They are going to destroy it root and branch and resurrect it through this kind of violent revolution. Somewhat parallel, but to an American variation, which was much less violent and much less destructive, the Weather People, right. The Weathermen. And there were the Red Brigades in Italy, are another right. version of it. So there were versions in other places in the context of our kind of revolutionary radicalism, though not everybody among the revolutionaries of this period were members of terrorist cells, right. terrorist brigades.
Right. And so I think you've given a very good kind of overview of this. Now, years later, can you even say that this film is part of a group of films that go back and revisit this subject? What are a couple of those other films, and where does this fit in terms of interpreting 25 to 35 years later what the meaning of this is historically?
Well, I began to think of, when you called me to do this, I began to think of other films. I had just seen a film, Good Morning Night, by Marco Bellocchio, a very gifted, very radical, but not politically radical
right.
Italian director, which works with the Red Brigades in a semi-surrealist form and a more comic form than Schlöndorff, who's not essentially a comic director, is much more solemn. And that film is probably more directly critical of the terrorists than Schlöndorff is in The Legend of Rita. Okay. But it's also an interesting, it's about the Moro kidnapping. Okay. And from the point of view of Bellocchio, an unjustified, infantile, murderous act by people who don't quite know what they're doing.
Right.
I thought of another film called, but much earlier, The Third Generation by Fassbinder, who only had contempt for the terrorists and didn't even suggest any of the complexity, just had contempt for them, because Fassbinder's politics were probably anarchic and anarchistic, but were totally I would assume, anti-ideological.
Right, right. So now you're pointing out I think some fairly interesting contrast. When this film was released, Schlöndorff even himself said that he thought certain critics essentially lynched him because he was criticized by both right and left, and those issues that they would be criticizing him about have to do with how much or little sympathy he has for certain factions being portrayed in the film. In the film, in your estimate, how really political are these people?
Well, that's problematic. It's probably, in some ways, the weakness of the film, that the early part, which defines them, has them robbing banks, talking about jargon, about not quite offing the pigs, but about destroying the state, destroying capitalism by robbing banks. They talk about the need for revolutionary violence, but you don't get much a complex suggestion, a complex insight into who they are, what motivates them, why they're so opposed to the state and to the capitalism itself. In fact, our heroine seems to have joined partially out of a love for the leader of this group.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not even quite clear what motivates her to be involved in this terrorist act.
Well, let me put it in in one of those little reversal of word kinds of ways. Do you think, I mean, from your point of view, do you think this is, a portrait of shallowness, or it's just shallow?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure. I was a little nonplussed. Was he depicting them as shallow, which, for example, Bellocchio I know is.
Right.
Or is this just a shallow portrait of a complex mechanism? I think it's probably a mixture of both.
Right.
Though in other films, I didn't mean Stannenheim by Reinhard Hoff, the Baader-Meinhof, especially Ulrich Meinhof, have much more complicated politics than one would think. And Meinhof, who was a journalist, wrote very well about the prisons and about her situation. So I wasn't quite clear I think thought he was providing us a serious portrait.
Well, I'm going to go with a serious portrait of some shallow people, that this is like a marginal group. It's not an ideologically driven group that can articulate it. They're, in that terrible phrase, sort of fellow travelers. They're, it's the spirit of the moment. And so they've sort of joined along. And we do have one of the things that I find interesting, because I agree with you about how much more interesting this gets at a certain point, when one of the groups of people, they sort of go off to the terrorism du jour. And that is, they say, oh, no, we've got to go to Beirut.
Beirut, of course.
So they're going off there because they're, in a certain sense, they're following the terrorist route, sort of like shallow kids would follow the club route. And I just going, oh, well, the next hot spot is, so we better go there. There's no sense of ideological, commitment. But what's interesting is when you insert someone like that into a place like East Germany, and that she chooses to stay.
Chooses to
stay in East Germany.
Rita, our heroine, our protagonist, who's probably the most interesting and most complex character in the film, chooses to stay. One, I think she comes out of a less affluent background than the others. But even that is not quite clear. There's some suggestion her mother died when very early, and she comes. She has a friend, Frederic, who clearly is who's sophisticated, knows a number of languages, feels upper class actually.
Right.
So and I know that many of the terrorists in the Baader-Meinhof were upper class. There were working class terrorist groups, but they were upper, middle, and upper class. But it's not quite clear. She seems to want to find out what real existing socialism is like in East Germany and see what life is like there. Though one would assume that she would already understand certain things by how the Stasi, the secret police, the houses they have, how they operate right away. But she doesn't. There's something, for a woman, she's a lovely woman, Rita. Here are the contradictions. She's terribly open, warm, loving, expressive, caring, benign, at the same time terribly naive intellectually, unreflective. And that I found very, very interesting in the portrait of her. And utterly, it seems to hold true perfectly. All those things are mutually exclusive. One could be a lovely human being and a fool politically.
Okay, let's see if there are any other historical examples of that. Yeah, no, absolutely the case. Now, one of the other interesting things I find just following that line is that, of course, East Germany, which had made some very interesting films, but of course, most of those films didn't have very much to do with portraying the dreadful conditions of this archly conservative, authoritarian communist regime there. And there is something about this film about the fact that she remains to some degree innocent. I mean, whether willfully so or not. And we're seeing things about East Germany that she's not recognizing. And some of that is brought up even dramatically, and she just goes into a kind of denial. I mean, when she puts the money in the tin for Nicaragua, and you know, if this was a German comedy, and it's not, everybody else in the room would be rolling their eyes. Because of the kind of naivete about the fact that, you know, you're being given a starvation wage anyway. You don't have the consumer goods that everybody has, and so now you're supposed to be giving your money away to a cause that's way over there. And then, of course, as one of the women says to her, with, you know, this trenchant view of the utter corruption of the system, you think that money goes to Nicaragua? You know, and again, all the evidence, as you pointed out, is there. No, you know, it goes to something like the West German beer served with the East German sausage at the big estate owned by the Stasi guy.
Yes, the Stasi live this, at least their safe house is this extremely bourgeois place. And of course, the suggestion is that the elite, the government elite, live extremely well, as we know they did in the satellites, and as they did in the Soviet Union,
right,
compared to the working people. The one thing I should mention is that East Germany was probably the wealthiest of all the satellite countries, that they were comparatively more successful than the other countries. Yeah. Their standard of living was the highest. So people weren't quite starving, but when she goes into the supermarket, there are barely any goods in the supermarket.
Oh,
it's a very spare place. And though our apartment is not uncomfortable, everything is sterile in that Stalinist housing project sense of much of the housing looks that way. But no, people, you don't feel, and I think I like that Schlendorf does not turn this into the kind of police state that the police are in every corner, that people are oppressing. It's just a society that we know they're imprisoned by the wall, which has been put up in '61, that they cannot move. She can move back and forth because she's allowed to by them.
Right.
But they can't. The people can't move, and the people all want to be in the West. They speak about the consumer goods of the West. They don't speak about freedom. They don't care about freedom.
That's a very interesting. But that's a very interesting, you know, point, because it takes it out of you know, the ideological war and grounds it, as the film grounds itself, in the daily life. I mean, which system do I want, or which goods do I want? What daily life do I get? And whatever the system is, if it gives me the stuff that they've got, which I envy, I want that. But
Absolutely.
it's not. But this is not made upon. You know, this is. You don't have to submit a doctoral thesis in political philosophy about this. You need to give somebody a Walmart card. I mean, it's sort of in crude terms like that.
Essentially, and then we know, reading up about East Germany, that there was the writers like and the singers like Wolf Biermann and Stefan Heim who complained about cultural orthodoxy and repression. The people didn't care. The people really didn't care. And what they wanted, yes, is what the West, a subway ride through Berlin, the subway no longer moved back and forth, is what they wanted, what the West offered, which they could pick up often on West German TV.
Right.
All the media, all what the media offered them, and all the baubles that they couldn't quite have.
Right.
And it's clear she has a relationship, which I thought was interesting, with Tanya,
yes,
the somewhat alcoholic, slightly punk, self-destructive friend,
right,
who her despair doesn't only come because she's living in East Germany. There seems to be some personal basis for it. And what I liked also, they clearly have a sexual relationship, but nothing is quite underlined here. It just happens. But the one thing that is suggested is her deepest passion is for Titania. Yeah. That though towards the end of the film she's thinking about marrying a hunk of a physicist who's going to Russia, who's not quite characterized really, except looking good, it's Titania who she has the real passion for and the real link to.
Well, I you know, to give the film the design of its narrative and to make her what I think is the interesting character that she is that she remains to the end, you know, impulsive and naive in certain kinds of ways, and seemingly, you know, sort of unaware of the fact that we might judge this relationship with Tatiana as the most profound there. And she's even willing to say, when she bumps into the other friend, and she says, "Oh, I'm so glad that you're so happy," and the friend says, "What, you think just because I have a husband and a child and I'm playing this role, that this, you know, what makes you think this is happiness?"
The friend, just one thing about the friend is interesting. The friend seems utterly disenchanted after the murder in the prison break, disenchanted with the terrorists themselves. She puts down her gun. She doesn't want, she's still there, but she doesn't want even anything to do with them. I think, and here she ends up in this ordinary, to use a paradox, bourgeois life, lower middle class, petty bourgeois life in East Germany, when this is a woman, an aristocratic lawyer,
right,
who is living outside her profession or class in her intellectual life.
Well, but you're talking about, I think, one of the genuine pleasures of the film, of that kind of thing. Somebody who ends up being well placed by East German standards and by living in deep cover in some way, and you say, and so you've given up everything that all of your neighbors constantly talk about around, with that glass of beer or with that cup of coffee. They're all talking about the things that you thought were so corrupt and that you needed to get away from, and your reward is now being in their circles of envy, but as them, not the person envied.
Absolutely. But Rita never, towards the end, she even speaks about freedom of speech. Okay, she says that there's less wealth here and there's less poverty. That's possibly true in East Germany than West Germany. But she also says there's greater freedom of speech. So she throws that out, and you're looking and wondering how do these fantasies, these illusions, still sustain themselves? And they seem to sustain themselves till the end, actually.
Well, because the ending, there is this kind of full circle to it in the sense that she begins as this woman of action, and then she's drifting as sort of undercover in ways, and then she's going to make the break in that way. She's returned in a certain sense to the woman of action of the first point, but terms of action have changed. I must say that this is there's a whole tradition of European, call them anti-heroes or anti-heroines, that go back to the 19th century, of people who are on some kind of quest. And we take the quest with them. And one of the things that's always conspicuous is that they really don't learn what the novel reader learns or what the spectator of the film. They're given opportunities at, call it, education or self-enlightenment or whatever, but whatever it is their character or personality, or you might even say the way in which they're trapped in history. They're so locked in a certain kind of way that they never see themselves in a broader context, or have, in that tradition of epiphanies and enlightenments, really being able to place yourself in the world. And I think she fits into that tradition. We know a lot more about her Germany and her historical circumstances at the time that she dies than she does.
I was thinking of a lovely line that the not unsympathetic, and people have criticized the film, that the Stasi man, Erwin, who befriends her and protects her, is not seen unsympathetically, though he puts Tanya in prison, I think, to protect Rita, says to her, yes, the people don't quite know what's good for them, but we do. We may take their freedom away to give them, essentially what he's saying is we take their freedom to give them greater freedom, right, ultimately. So he says it very directly. And they, the Stasi man Erwin and the head of the Stasi, or the local district head, are clearly somewhat taken with the romantic terrorists, because the terrorists, even though they see it as infantile, Lenin's notion of infantile communism, infantile radicalism, they see them as maintaining some kind of idealism, some kind of foolish, quixotic, intense passion to redress the wrongs of the society.
Well, the Stasi people are portrayed as almost as these, highly skilled, upper middle managers. Their particular company that they manage happens to be state security and espionage. But, if they were in import-export, or if they were in certain manufacturing sector, it just happens to be in this society the best management positions you can get with all the perks you would want are serving state security in this way. So they're seen, as opportunists of history.
But we do know that the Stasi, Christa Wolf, all sorts of people ended up, writers, collaborating with them because they carried thousands of informants and dossiers on people they saw as possibly suspect. Though I just saw Munich, and I was thinking of the Mossad. They were not faced with those kind of situations where they had to engage in counterterrorism and kill opponents and engage in assassinations. I would assume that Stasi essentially were doing bureaucratic, ugly, sometimes amoral bureaucratic work, but bureaucratic work.
Yeah. So we have actually come to an it happens, Len. We've come to an end. But I like the way you happen to introduce the subject, because since Steven Spielberg's Munich is now out and is the object of debate on a number of things. It's a very interesting thing. I would simply encourage people to do, to put these films side by side and to line up how they portray moral responsibility, terrorism, the power of the state working outside the state or working inside the state. We can do some good work in thinking about those things. Hold on for just a second while I talk to our friends out there in television land. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque or about City University Television, it should come as no surprise that you should visit our website, where there are ample sources of information and ways to communicate with us. Again, no surprise, by email. That address is www.cuny.tv. Once again, www.cuny.tv. Len, always a pleasure to have you here. I think you hold the record as our veteran guest from the first season on, and for many more. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Great. And I hope you enjoyed our discussion today and will join us again when we continue to stroll through the archives of film history. Thanks, and goodbye for now.